Hi, I'm Mia Thompson. I've never believed in ghost stories. I grew up in Alice Springs, in the heart of the Australian outback, where the sun burns your skin, and the wind whispers secrets that most people ignore. Here, the old folks always repeat the saying, never turn your back on the desert, or it will swallow you. My grandmother, a woman with deep eyes and endless stories, would say this as she braided my younger sister Evie's hair. I laughed, thinking it was just another local custom, like avoiding the sacred trails of the Anangba people, or not camping near dead trees, because, according to legend, they harbor restless spirits. But that spring, everything changed. It was early October, and the heat was already pressing. Ruby, my best friend since we were kids, had convinced me, Evie, Theodore, and Henry to go on a silly adventure, exploring the old abandoned mining camp about 20 kilometers from the city. It's just a walk, Mia Ruby said, tossing her red hair with that smile that always got me into trouble. What's the worst that could happen? We'll strike gold, get rich. Theodore, the skeptic of the group, rolled his eyes, adjusting his crooked glasses. Or we'll die of heat stroke, he muttered. Henry, always the quiet one, just shrugged, but his eyes were bright with curiosity. Evie, all 14, and with a courage that sometimes scared me, was already bouncing with excitement. I should have listened to my gut. Something about the idea felt wrong. Maybe it was the way the wind was howling louder that morning, or the way the red clouds hovered above the horizon, tinged with desert dust. But Ruby had a way of making everything seem like a grand adventure, and I didn't want to be the spoilsport. So we packed our backpacks, filled our water bottles, and set off at dawn. The mining camp was a forgotten ruin, a skeleton of wood and rusting metal swallowed up by the desert. Stories said the mine closed in the 1970s after a collapse that killed half a dozen workers. Some said the miners had dug too deep, disturbing something that shouldn't be disturbed, as my grandmother liked to say. Others spoke of strange lights seen at night, or voices echoing from the depths. I thought it was just folklore, like the custom of leaving offerings of water along the trails to appease the desert spirits. We arrived at noon, sweaty and exhausted. The place was worse than I'd imagined: shacks crumbling, broken tools strewn across the ground, and a mine entrance sealed with rotting boards. The air felt heavy, as if the desert were holding its breath. Evie, always the bold one, ran to the mine entrance and banged on the boards. Hey, ghosts! I'm here to talk, she yelled, laughing. Theodore frowned. Stop it, Evie. This isn't funny. Then we heard it. A low, moaning sound coming from inside the mine. It wasn't the wind, the desert was still, without a breath of air. Ruby froze, the smile fading from her face. Henry took a step back, tightening his grip on the strap of his backpack. Did you hear that? He whispered. I wanted to tell him it was just our imaginations, but the sound came again, clearer, like a whisper in a language I didn't understand. Let's go, I said, my voice shaking more than I would have liked. But Ruby, stubborn as ever, shook her head. No, we came all this way. Let's at least take a look. Before I could protest, she picked up a rock and began banging on the boards of the entrance. The sound echoed, each thud seeming louder, more wrong. Theodore tried to pull it away, but one of the boards gave way with a snap, revealing a dark hole that seemed to swallow the sunlight. And then something moved inside. It wasn't an animal or a trick of the light. It was a shadow, tall and shapeless, that seemed to pulse in the darkness. Evie screamed, and Henry grabbed my arm, pulling me back. Mia, run, he shouted. But Ruby stood there, mesmerized, staring at the hole. Ruby, now! I yelled, running toward her. As I pulled her away, the shadow seemed to grow, as if it were stretching toward us. We ran. We ran as if the desert itself were hunting us. The whimper turned to a low roar, and I swear I felt something cold brush the back of my neck, like icy fingers. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath. The mine was out of sight, but the weight in the air hadn't gone away. I looked back at the others. Evie was shaking, hugging herself. Theodore was pale, his crooked glasses almost falling off. Henry said nothing, but his eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something to appear. Ruby, for the first time, didn't have a joke or a smile. That night, back home, I couldn't sleep. My grandmother's saying echoed in my head, "Never turn your back on the desert, or it will swallow you." And in the silence of my room, I heard that murmur again, low, insistent, coming from somewhere. Place outside. I looked out the window, at the desert that stretched beyond the city, and saw, for a brief second, a shadow moving among the dead trees. I knew it wasn't over. Whatever was in that mine had seen us, and now I think it's following us. The days after our escape from the mining camp were strange, as if the world had gone a little askew. Alice Springs, which had always felt so familiar, now had a weight I couldn't explain. The local saying "the desert keeps what you leave behind" was running through my head, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the shapeless shadow of the mine. But it didn't appear. Not right away. I tried to convince myself it was just the heat, or the exhaustion, or our imaginations playing tricks on us. Ruby, of course, was back to her usual self, laughing loudly and joking about our great adventure. But I could see her eyes darting away when anyone mentioned the mine. Evie, on the other hand, was different. My sister, who had never been afraid of anything, now woke up screaming in the middle of the night, talking about dreams of voices that sang in the dark. Theodore locked himself in the house, obsessively researching the history of the mine on his old computer. Henry was quiet as usual, but I caught him sketching strange symbols in a notebook, things he swore he'd seen on the broken boards at the mine entrance. That Wednesday, 3 days after the incident, we decided to meet at Ruby's house to talk. We needed to figure out what had happened. Her mother, a crystal collector who believed in desert energies, was out of town, so we had the house to ourselves. We sat on the porch, the setting sun turning the sky blood red. The wind carried the dry smell of the Outback, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "I found some stuff," Theodore began, pushing his glasses up his nose. He pulled a stack of crumpled papers from his backpack. The mine didn't just close because of the collapse. There was something else. Reports from the time tell of workers going crazy, saying they heard voices coming from deep underground. One of them, he disappeared. They said he went into the mine one night and never came out. Evie hugged her knees, her face pale. "The voices in my dreams, they're like chants, but they don't sound human. It's like they're calling to me." "Stop it," Evie, Ruby snapped, her voice sharper than usual. "It's just a dream. We got scared, that's all. There's nothing there." But she was drumming her fingers on the table uneasily. Henry, who had been listening until then, pulled the notebook from his pocket. "I saw this on the boards," he said, showing a drawing. It was a circle with crooked lines inside, like a cross between a cross and a spiral. "I don't know what it is, but it seemed important." Theodore took the notebook, frowning. "That sounds like an Aboriginal symbol, but it's wrong. Kinda twisted. My aunt knows an Anang elder. Maybe he knows what it is." Before I could say anything, the wind stopped blowing. The silence that fell was so heavy it seemed to suck the air. Then there was the sound, a low murmur, like the one we'd heard in the mine, but closer now, as if it were coming from the backyard. Evie jumped, knocking over her chair. "It's them," she whispered, her eyes wide. "The voices." "There's nothing there," Ruby insisted, but her voice was shaking. She stood and walked over to the fence, peering out at the empty lot that looked out over the desert. "See? Nothing." But I did. In the corner of the yard, near a dead tree, the ground seemed to move. It wasn't the wind, because the air was still. It was as if the earth were breathing, pulsing slowly. Ruby, Come back here, I called, my heart pounding. She turned to answer me, but then she screamed. Something had grabbed her ankle. A pale, bony hand, reaching up from the earth like the desert, was spitting out a corpse. Ruby fell, thrashing as the hand pulled her away. Henry was the first to react, running over and kicking the thing hard. The hand wrenched free, leaving red marks on her skin, and disappeared into the ground as quickly as it had appeared. What the fuck? Ruby screamed, crawling away. Evie was crying, holding on to Theodore, who looked as terrified as I felt. The murmuring came again, louder, coming from all sides now, like the entire desert was talking. Get inside, now, I yelled. We ran into the house, locking the door. The sound stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. We huddled in the living room, panting, while Ruby trembled, staring at her scarred ankle. That wasn't real, she muttered, more to herself than to us. It can't be real. Theodore, still holding Henry's notebook, spoke softly. We messed with something we shouldn't have. That girl, she's not just a girl. And now I think whatever's in there knows who we are. That night, no one wanted to go home. We slept in the living room, with the lights on, but sleep didn't come easily. I listened, waiting for the murmur to return, and at some point, I swear I saw a shadow pass by the window, tall, misshapen, like the one we'd seen in the mine. The next day, Theodore called to say that his aunt had arranged to take us to the Anang Elder. He knows things that aren't in the books, he said. But Mia, he told us not to go back to the desert. Not until we know how to deal with what's there. I knew he was right. But the desert wouldn't wait. It had already marked us. The desert never forgives. My grandmother always said this, her tone a mix of warning and regret, as she rubbed her calloused hands together as if she could erase the stories she carried. What you give to the Outback, it takes. And what it takes, it never gives back. I hadn't understood the weight of those words until that week. Now they echo within me like the whisper that has never stopped haunting us. After the incident in Ruby's backyard, we took Theodore's advice and went to find the Anang Elder, a man named Weru, whose eyes seemed to see further than any of us could. He lived in a hut on the outskirts of Alice Springs, surrounded by rocks painted with symbols that were disturbingly reminiscent of Henry's drawing. Weru listened silently as we told him about the mine, the shadow, the voices. When we were finished, he lit a small fire and threw in herbs that smelled of dry earth. You have opened a door, he said, his voice hoarse. What lives down there is not a spirit, not a person. It is older, hungry, and now it wants you. Weru gave us a warning to seal the door. We had to return to the mine and burn an amulet made of sacred earth and kangaroo bones, reciting words he had taught us. But there was a price. The desert always takes its toll, he murmured, looking directly at me. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if he knew something I didn't. There was no choice. That night, under a starless sky, we took Ruby's jeep and drove back to the mining camp. The air was thick, the silence so heavy it seemed to scream. Evie held my hand tightly, her eyes still haunted by nightmares. Theodore carried the amulet, wrapped in red cloth, while Henry held a flashlight, his fingers shaking. Ruby, trying to keep up a brave front, led the way, but I could see the fear in her tense shoulders. The entrance to the mine was different. The broken boards seemed more crooked, as if something had forced them apart from the inside. The murmur returned, loud now, almost deafening, like a chorus of voices that weren't human. Stay together, I whispered, my voice nearly drowned out by the sound. We set the amulet on the ground near the entrance, and Theodore began to recite Weru's words, his voice wavering. Ruby lit a fire, and the scent of herbs mixed with the dry air. Then the shadow returned. It wasn't a vague shape like before, it had contours now. A tall figure with long, twisting limbs, eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. It didn't move like a person. It seemed to glide, as if the ground were part of it. Evie screamed, and Henry threw the flashlight at the thing, but the light only passed through, as if it were made of smoke. "Keep going," I yelled at Theodore as he chanted faster, the amulet beginning to burn. The shadow surged forward, and I felt a sharp chill as it passed over me, as if it were sucking the air from my lungs. Ruby picked up a rock and threw it, but the thing didn't react. Instead, it turned toward Evie, who stood frozen, her eyes wide. "Evie, run!" I screamed, rushing to pull her away. But the shadow was faster. It enveloped Evie like a mist, and my sister fell, gasping, clutching her chest. Henry threw himself in front of her, trying to push the thing away with his hands, but the shadow shoved him with a force that sent him flying into the mine's boards. I heard the crack of impact, and he lay still on the ground. "Henry!" Ruby screamed, rushing toward him, but I knew from the way his body was twisted that he wasn't going to get up. Despair engulfed me, but Theodore finished the chant, and the amulet burst into blue flames, lighting up the night. The shadow made a sound that wasn't a scream, but something worse, a wail that shook the ground. It shrank back, shrinking back into the mine shaft, and the boards seemed to close themselves, as if the desert were sealing the door. When the fire died, silence returned, but it brought no relief. Evie was alive, but she was shaking, pale, with dark marks on her arm where the shadow had touched her. Ruby was crying, holding Henry's body, which was no longer breathing. Theodore just stared at the ground, his hands smeared with ash. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything, but all I could do was pull Evie to me and hold her tight. We drove back to town at dawn, in silence. Henry was buried 2 days later, in a small ceremony. Ruby's mother couldn't stop crying, and my heart broke every time I saw Evie staring into space, as if part of her had remained in that mine. Where came to the funeral, but he didn't say anything. He only left a stone painted on Henry's grave, with the same crooked symbol we saw on the tablets. The voices have stopped, but the desert hasn't. Sometimes at night I feel it calling to me, as if it knows I'm still here. Ruby doesn't talk about adventures anymore, and Theodore has moved to Sydney, saying he couldn't stand the Outback anymore. Evie still has nightmares, and I can see the marks on her arm getting darker. As if something was still inside it. I don't know if we've truly sealed the door. Sometimes, when the wind blows, I hear a low murmur, and I wonder if the desert has truly finished taking its toll, or if it's still waiting. This was today's story. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Share it with your friends for more stories like this. Until next time.